People like you don't belong in my ballroom." The words landed harder than the crystal silence hanging beneath the chandeliers. Every conversation stopped. Every smile faded. For a moment, even the soft piano music drifting through the grand hall seemed to disappear. Ava Johnson stood perfectly still in the center of Whitmore Gardens, one of the most sought-after wedding venues in South Carolina. Sunlight streamed through 20-foot arched windows, painting golden reflections across polished marble floors. Around her, brides-to-be flipped through catalogs, event coordinators carried clipboards, and staff members arranged floral displays worth thousands of dollars. Yet all eyes were suddenly fixed on her. Ava slowly lowered the leather portfolio she had been holding against her chest. Inside it sat the signed reservation agreement she had finalized nearly 8 months earlier. Her wedding was only 12 days away. 12 days. After 3 years of saving every extra dollar from double shifts at Charleston Children's Medical Center, after skipping vacations, postponing purchases, and working countless overnight weekends, she had finally secured the venue she had dreamed about since childhood. She looked at the man standing behind the reception counter. Edward Whitmore, owner of the estate, local businessman, respected community figure, the kind of man whose name appeared on charity plaques and newspaper headlines. His silver tie was perfectly centered. His posture remained calm, but there was something cold behind his eyes, something that made Ava feel as though the decision had been made long before she walked through the door. "I'm sorry," Ava said quietly. "Could you repeat that?" Edward folded his hands. "I believe I was clear." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ava could feel dozens of strangers watching, waiting, judging. Her engagement ring felt unusually heavy against her hand. "We have a signed contract," she replied. "The deposit cleared months ago." Edward glanced briefly at the paperwork before looking away. Circumstances change. A young receptionist nearby shifted uncomfortably in her seat. One event coordinator lowered her eyes toward the floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody challenged him. Outside the windows, a warm spring breeze moved through rows of white roses lining the garden pathways. Inside, the air felt frozen. Ava took a slow breath. Her grandmother had always taught her that dignity was not something another person could take. It was something you carried yourself. Even now, with embarrassment burning in her chest, she refused to raise her voice. "What circumstances?" she asked. Edward's jaw tightened. "This venue has a certain image." There it was. Not loud, not direct, but clear enough. Ava felt the meaning settle over the room. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman quietly closed her wedding brochure. The silence said what nobody wanted to say aloud. Ava's heart pounded, yet her face remained calm. She had spent her life learning how to recognize moments like this. Moments when doors quietly closed. Moments when smiles became barriers. Moments when people decided who belonged before hearing a single word. Edward adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "I'm prepared to return your deposit." Ava stared at him, not because she was shocked anymore, because she suddenly realized he expected her to leave, to accept it, to walk away quietly. Instead, she stood her ground beneath the glittering chandeliers. The sunlight shifted across the marble floor between them, and for the first time, Edward Whitmore noticed that the young woman standing before him wasn't angry. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't leaving. She simply looked him directly in the eye and asked the question that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. "If I leave today," Ava said softly, "will you at least tell me the truth?" Ava's question lingered in the air long after the words left her lips. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Even Edward Whitmore seemed caught off guard by the calmness behind it. Most people became defensive when embarrassed. Others became emotional. Ava did neither. She simply waited. For several seconds, the only sound came from the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant splash of fountain somewhere beyond the garden courtyard. Edward's expression hardened. "I have already explained the situation." Ava nodded slowly. "No, sir. You explained the outcome." Her voice remained steady. "I asked for the reason." A young employee standing near a display of wedding invitations lowered her eyes. Another staff member pretended to rearrange a stack of brochures. The tension spreading through the ballroom had become impossible to ignore. Edward looked toward the windows as if searching for an easier answer. None came. Finally, he reached for the contract lying on the reception desk and slid it back toward Ava. "Take the refund." Ava glanced down at the document. The paper seemed strangely small after everything she had sacrificed to earn it. She remembered the overnight shifts at the hospital, the holidays spent working while others celebrated, the countless mornings she drove home exhausted as the sun rose over Charleston Harbor. Every extra dollar had gone toward this wedding, not because she cared about luxury, because she cared about family, because she wanted one perfect day for the people she loved most. Her eyes drifted to the engagement photo tucked inside the portfolio. Daniel's smile stared back at her. Warm, honest, certain, the kind of smile that made difficult days easier to survive. She thought about calling him, but not yet. She needed a moment first. "You know," she said quietly, "my grandmother used to tell me that truth becomes heavier the longer someone carries it." Edward folded his arms. His jaw tightened again. Ava could see something behind his eyes now. Not guilt, not regret, fear. Fear of saying aloud what everyone in the room already understood. Before he could respond, the entrance doors opened. A gust of warm spring air drifted through the lobby, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Several guests stepped inside from the gardens, laughing softly as they returned from venue tour. Their conversation stopped almost immediately when they noticed the atmosphere. One older couple exchanged confused glances. Nobody understood exactly what had happened, only that something important had. Ava slowly picked up her portfolio. The leather edges felt worn beneath her fingertips. Her grandmother had given it to her years ago when she graduated nursing school. She still remembered the words written inside. "Never let another person decide your worth." For the first time since arriving, a faint sadness touched her eyes. Not because of the venue, not because of the money, because she had hoped things were changing. She had hoped people like Edward Whitmore belonged to another generation, another chapter of history. Yet here she was, standing in one of the most beautiful buildings in the city and feeling smaller than she had in years. Edward finally spoke. "Miss Johnson, I suggest we end this conversation." Ava looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a small nod. "All right." The relief that briefly crossed his face did not go unnoticed. But instead of turning toward the exit, Ava reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a second before selecting a contact she had called countless times throughout her life. The line rang once, then twice, then a familiar voice answered. Warm, gentle, steady. The voice that had guided her through every storm she had ever faced. Ava swallowed softly. "Grandpa," she said, her eyes fixed on Edward Whitmore across the room. "Are you busy today?" Ava held the phone against her ear while the silence inside the ballroom stretched tighter with every passing second. On the other end of the line, Samuel Johnson chuckled softly. It was the familiar laugh she had heard since childhood, the same one that always seemed to make difficult days feel a little smaller. "For you," he said. "Never busy." Ava closed her eyes briefly. Just hearing his voice steadied her heartbeat. "I am at Whitmore Gardens," she said. "Would you mind coming by?" There was a short pause. "Of course," Samuel replied. "Give me a little time. I will be there." "Thank you, Grandpa. Everything all right?" Ava glanced across the room. Edward Whitmore stood near the reception desk, pretending to organize paperwork that no longer held his attention. Several employees remained frozen in place, listening without appearing to listen. "It will be," Ava answered quietly. Samuel did not press for details. He never did. "Then I will see you soon." The call ended. Ava lowered the phone and slipped it back in her purse. The room seemed different now. Nothing had changed physically. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead. Fresh white roses still decorated the displays. Sunlight still poured through the massive windows overlooking the gardens. Yet something invisible had shifted. Edward cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, I do not see how involving another person changes the situation." Ava looked at him calmly. "Maybe it does not." She rested her portfolio on the counter. But my grandfather taught me never to walk away from the truth. Edward said nothing. The words seemed to unsettle him more than an argument would have. Minutes passed. Guests continued moving through the venue, though many slowed as they sensed the tension lingering beneath the elegant surroundings. Near the entrance, a young coordinator quietly approached Ava. She could not have been older than 25. Her name tag read Melissa. "Miss Johnson," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I am sorry." Ava offered a small smile. "Thank you." Melissa hesitated. "This is not right." Before Ava could respond, the young woman quickly stepped away, clearly nervous about being overheard. Ava watched her disappear around a corner. Small acts of courage often mattered more than people realized. Outside, dark clouds had begun drifting across the bright afternoon sky. Shadows moved across the gardens in slow waves. The air beyond the windows looked heavier now, carrying the promise of rain. Ava walked toward a bench near the lobby entrance and sat down. Her thoughts drifted back to Samuel, to the tiny house where he had raised her after her mother passed away, to summer afternoons spent on a front porch swing, to lessons about kindness, patience, and self-respect. He had never been wealthy, never powerful, yet somehow everyone who met him walked away feeling richer. 20 minutes later, the distant sound of an engine rolled across the circular driveway outside. Several heads turned automatically toward the entrance. A dark blue pickup truck pulled beneath the covered drop-off area. It was old but immaculate, polished so carefully that it reflected the gray afternoon sky like glass. Ava stood slowly. Through the front windows, she saw the driver's door open. A tall elderly man stepped out wearing a neatly pressed tan jacket and a pair of polished brown shoes. His silver hair caught the fading light. The moment Edward Whitmore looked through those windows and saw Samuel Johnson standing outside, all the color drained from his face. For a moment, nobody seemed to breathe. Edward Whitmore stared through the glass doors as if he had seen a ghost step out of the truck. The confident businessman who had controlled every conversation that afternoon suddenly looked uncertain. Ava noticed it immediately. His shoulders stiffened. His hands stopped moving. Even the employees nearest the reception desk exchanged confused glances. They had never seen their employer react like that. Outside, Samuel Johnson adjusted the collar of his jacket and looked toward the entrance with the calm expression he always carried. He was not a wealthy celebrity. He was not a politician. There was no security team surrounding him. Nothing about his appearance explained the reaction unfolding inside the ballroom. Yet Edward looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Ava pushed open the front door and stepped outside. The spring air felt cooler now. Dark clouds continued gathering overhead, casting soft shadows across the gardens. Samuel smiled the moment he saw her. "There's my girl." Ava walked forward and embraced him. The familiar scent of cedar and aftershave instantly brought back memories of childhood summers and long conversations on the front porch. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You never have to thank me for that." Samuel looked at her carefully. His warm eyes immediately sensed something was wrong. "Tell me what happened." Ava hesitated. She did not want anger. She did not want revenge. She simply wanted honesty. "The venue canceled our wedding." Samuel listened quietly. "Today?" Ava nodded. 12 days before the ceremony. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, though not surprise. It was the disappointment of someone watching an old mistake repeat itself in a newer generation. Samuel glanced toward the ballroom entrance. Through the glass, Edward remained standing exactly where he had been moments earlier. Their eyes met across the distance. Something passed between the two older men. Recognition. History. A memory neither had expected to revisit. Samuel became very still. "Edward Whitmore," he said softly. Ava blinked. "You know him?" Samuel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the sky for a moment, as though searching through decades of memories. Inside the building, Edward finally began walking toward the entrance. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The staff watched in silence. Nobody understood why their employer suddenly appeared nervous. When Edward reached the doors, he stopped. The elegant ballroom behind him felt strangely small now. The fountain outside splashed gently in the background. Wind moved through the rose bushes lining the stone pathway. Samuel offered a polite nod. It has been a long time. Edward swallowed hard. Far too long. Ava looked between them, confusion growing with every second. This was not the conversation she expected. The tension she had witnessed earlier had changed into something else entirely. Something deeper. Something older. Edward's eyes lowered briefly before returning to Samuel's face. "I never thought I would see you again," he admitted. Samuel's expression remained calm. "Life has a way of surprising us." The words sounded simple, but they landed heavily. Edward looked away. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed unable to hold another person's gaze. And as Ava watched the powerful owner of Whitmore Gardens struggle to find his words, she realized her grandfather was carrying a story that nobody else in that ballroom knew. The wind picked up across the courtyard, carrying the scent of rain and fresh roses through the open entrance. Employees gathered quietly near the lobby, pretending to work while listening to every word. Ava remained beside her grandfather, watching the strange exchange unfold. Edward Whitmore looked nothing like the confident man who had confronted her earlier. His face seemed older now, tired, burdened. Samuel studied him with calm patience. "You remember," Samuel said gently. Edward let out a slow breath. "Not a day has passed that I forgot." Ava frowned. "Forgot what?" Neither man answered immediately. The silence stretched between them. Then Samuel looked at his granddaughter. 35 years ago, I worked maintenance for the county transit department." Ava nodded. She knew that part of the story. Samuel had spent decades working long hours to support his family. What she did not understand was how that connected to Edward Whitmore. Samuel glanced toward the gray clouds overhead. "One summer afternoon, I was driving home after a double shift." Edward lowered his eyes. His hands trembled slightly. "Samuel," he said quietly, "you do not have to. I think I do." Samuel's voice remained kind. Not angry, not accusing, simply honest. Several people inside the ballroom moved closer. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Samuel continued. "There was an accident on a rural road outside Charleston. A family vehicle had gone off the shoulder." Edward closed his eyes. Ava saw emotion pass across his face. Real emotion, the kind that cannot be rehearsed. "A little girl was trapped inside," Samuel said. "She could not get out. Her parents were screaming for help." Ava noticed Edward looking away. Samuel continued speaking softly. "Most people were afraid to get involved. They stayed back. They waited for emergency crews." The old man smiled sadly. "I did not think about any of that. I only saw a scared child." Edward's shoulders slumped. The lobby had become completely silent. Even the receptionist had stopped answering phones. Samuel looked toward the elegant ballroom surrounding them. That little girl survived. She grew up, built a life, had opportunities she might never have received otherwise. Edward swallowed hard. "My daughter," he whispered. Ava's eyes widened. Samuel nodded. "Emily." The name seemed to echo through the room. Ava stared at Edward. Everything suddenly felt unreal. Edward pressed a hand against the reception counter as though steadying himself. "The doctors told us later that a few more minutes could have changed everything." His voice cracked. "A few more minutes." Samuel simply nodded. He was not telling the story to claim credit. Ava could see that clearly. He was only telling the truth. Edward looked at him with eyes full of regret. "I searched for you afterward." Samuel smiled faintly. "Life moved on." "No," Edward replied. "I should have done more." The words came out barely above a whisper. Rain began tapping softly against the windows. Tiny droplets rolled down the glass, overlooking the gardens. Ava watched the storm arrive, while an even larger storm unfolded inside Edward Whitmore. The powerful businessman who had spent years building his reputation now stood face to face with a man whose courage had once preserved the most important person in his world. And for the first time that afternoon, Edward seemed unable to escape what he had done. Rain continued to slide down the tall windows in thin silver lines. The ballroom that had felt grand and imposing earlier now seemed strangely quiet, as though the building itself were listening. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody knew what to say. Ava stood beside Samuel, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She had known her grandfather her entire life, yet she was discovering a chapter of his story she had never heard before. Samuel never talked about his sacrifices. He never collected favors. He never reminded people of what he had done for them. He simply moved forward. That was who he was. Edward stared at the floor for several long seconds. The sound of rain tapping against the glass filled the silence. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were no longer focused on contracts or business decisions. They were focused on memories. "Emily still keeps the photograph," he said quietly. Samuel tilted his head. "What photograph?" A faint smile touched Edward's face before disappearing again. "The one taken at the hospital after she came home." His voice softened. "She was holding a stuffed rabbit. You were standing beside her." Samuel chuckled gently. "I remember the rabbit." A few employees exchanged surprised looks. The conversation felt deeply personal now, almost sacred. Ava watched Edward carefully. The man standing before them was not the same man she had met earlier. The confidence remained, but something beneath it had cracked open. Years of assumptions, years of pride, years of believing he understood people at first glance. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant horizon. Inside, nobody moved. Edward looked directly at Ava for the first time since her grandfather arrived. "Your grandfather never told you?" Ava shook her head. "He never talks about himself." Samuel smiled. "There is not much to tell." Several people near the reception desk almost laughed at the understatement. Edward certainly did not. He looked overwhelmed by it. "There is plenty to tell," he said. "You changed our lives." Samuel's expression remained calm. "I helped someone who needed help. That is all." The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect everyone listening. Ava felt emotion building in her chest, not because of the story itself, but because it perfectly reflected the man who had raised her. Samuel never measured people by status, never by money, never by appearance. He measured them by character. Rainwater gathered along the stone pathways outside. The rose gardens swayed gently beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain continued its steady rhythm. Edward slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The gesture revealed a vulnerability nobody in the room had expected to see. "For 35 years, he said quietly, I told myself I would repay that debt if I ever saw you again." Samuel looked at him kindly. "Life is not about debts." Edward lowered his gaze. "Maybe not." His voice nearly disappeared. "But today I forgot the lesson you taught me." The words settled over the room like the rain outside. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Ava felt her heart tighten as she realized what was happening. This was no longer about a wedding venue. It was no longer about a contract. It was about a man being forced to confront the difference between the person he had become and the person he once promised himself he would be. The rain grew steadier outside, drumming softly against the glass roof panels above the reception hall. Every person in the building seemed frozen in place, caught between the elegance of the venue and the weight of the moment unfolding inside it. Ava looked at Edward carefully. She could see the struggle written across his face. It was not the fear of losing money. It was not the fear of public embarrassment. It was something deeper, the fear that comes when a person can no longer avoid seeing themselves clearly. Edward slowly turned toward the staff gathered nearby. Some had worked for him for years. Others were newer employees who had only known him as a successful businessman. None of them had ever seen him like this. He took a slow breath, then another. Finally, he spoke. "There is something all of you should know." His voice was lower now, stripped of authority and pride. 35 years ago, my daughter was given a future because of this man. He gestured towards Samuel. No one looked away. Edward swallowed hard. "Everything I have built since then exists because my family was allowed to remain whole." The room remained silent, except for the rain. Ava noticed tears forming in the eyes of the receptionist standing near the front desk. Even Melissa looked emotional. Samuel shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. He had never sought recognition. Edward continued. "When I first saw Miss Johnson walk through those doors months ago, I saw a customer. His voice trembled. Today, I allowed myself to see something else. I made assumptions. I judged before I listened. He looked directly at Ava, and I was wrong. The words seemed to echo through the ballroom. Ava stood quietly, saying nothing. She remembered the humiliation she had felt earlier, the disappointment, the confusion. Yet standing beside her grandfather now, anger seemed distant. Samuel had taught her that dignity did not need revenge. It needed truth. A sudden movement near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The front doors opened, and a woman hurried inside, carrying an umbrella. She looked to be in her early 40s, dressed in a navy raincoat. The moment Edward saw her, his eyes widened. Emily. She had clearly arrived in a hurry. Strands of damp hair framed her face as she looked around the room. Then she saw Samuel. Her hand immediately rose to her mouth. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. Before anyone could speak, she crossed the room. The emotion in her eyes left no doubt. She remembered. Decades had passed, but she remembered. "Mr. Johnson." Her voice cracked. "I cannot believe it is really you." Samuel smiled warmly. "Hello, Emily." Tears filled her eyes. "My father called me 5 minutes ago. The second he told me your name, I drove straight here." She looked at Ava, then back at Samuel. "You were the first hero I ever knew." No one moved. No one spoke. The rain continued falling beyond the windows, while years of forgotten gratitude finally found its way back into the room. And, standing in the center of it all, Ava realized the truth was no longer hidden. It was finally being seen by everyone. Ava watched as Emily stood beside Samuel, unable to take her eyes off him. The years seemed to disappear from her face. For a brief moment, she was no longer a successful executive or the daughter of a prominent businessman. She was simply a woman remembering the stranger who had once changed the course of her life. Samuel smiled gently, clearly embarrassed by the attention. "You're doing well," he said. Emily laughed softly through her tears. "I'm doing well because I was given the chance to." Her voice carried across the silent ballroom. Nobody missed the meaning behind her words. Edward remained motionless. The weight of everything that had happened pressed visibly upon him. The elegant venue, the polished floors, the expensive decor, all seemed insignificant compared to the truth standing in front of him. Emily turned toward Ava. "I'm so sorry." Ava blinked. "You do not owe me an apology." "Maybe not," Emily replied, "but I want to give one anyway." She glanced at her father. What happened here should never have happened. Edward closed his eyes briefly. Hearing the disappointment in his daughter's voice seemed harder than anything else he had faced that day. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Ava. The room became completely still. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology." Ava listened without speaking. Edward took a slow breath. "Earlier today, I made assumptions about you before. I knew you. I allowed prejudice and pride to guide my actions." His voice trembled slightly. There is no excuse for that. The honesty in his words surprised everyone. Edward Whitmore was known for confidence, certainty, and control. Admitting fault in front of employees, clients, and strangers was something nobody expected to witness. Rain continued to tap softly against the windows. Samuel remained silent, allowing Edward to speak for himself. "Your grandfather showed courage when he had every reason to walk away," Edward continued. "Today, you showed dignity when you had every reason to become angry." Ava felt emotion rise in her chest, not because she needed validation, but because the truth was finally being spoken aloud. Edward stepped forward. "If you will allow it, I would like to honor the agreement exactly as promised." Ava looked at him carefully. "Because of my grandfather?" Edward shook his head. "No," the answer came immediately. "Because it is the right thing to do." For the first time all afternoon, a genuine smile touched Samuel's face. Small, quiet, proud. Emily reached for her father's hand. Edward glanced at her before continuing. "The ballroom is yours. The gardens are yours. Every service included in your original package remains exactly as agreed." He paused. "And if there is anything else needed for your wedding day, it will be provided." Ava looked towards Samuel. Her grandfather gave a subtle nod. The same nod he had given her throughout her life whenever she faced an important choice. Not telling her what to do, simply reminding her who she was. Ava turned back to Edward. The rain outside had begun to slow. Light filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the marble floor. "I accept your apology," she said. Relief washed across Edward's face. Not relief from consequences. Relief from finally telling the truth. And as the tension that had filled the ballroom slowly faded away, something far more valuable took its place. Understanding. 2 weeks later, the storm clouds were gone. Morning sunlight poured across Whitmore Gardens, transforming every window into sheets of gold. The rose bushes lining the pathways were in full bloom, their colors glowing beneath a clear Carolina sky. Guests arrived dressed in soft pastels and dark suits, their laughter drifting through the warm spring air. The fountain at the center of the courtyard sparkled beneath the sunlight, its gentle rhythm blending with the distant sound of a string quartet preparing for the ceremony. Ava stood near the entrance of the bridal suite, holding a small bouquet of white roses. For a moment, she simply looked out the window. The garden she had nearly lost stretched before her exactly as she had imagined them. Beautiful, peaceful, full of possibility. A soft knock sounded at the door. When she turned, she found Samuel standing there. His tan suit was perfectly pressed. A small silver tie clip reflected the morning light. Ava smiled immediately. "You look handsome, Grandpa." Samuel laughed. "I was about to say the same thing about you." For a few seconds, neither spoke. They simply stood together, sharing the quiet. It reminded Ava of countless moments throughout her life. Graduation ceremonies, family dinners, long conversations on front porches as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Samuel had always been there. Steady, constant, the kind of person who changed lives without demanding recognition for it. "Ready?" he asked gently. Ava nodded. "I am." Together they stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, guests slowly rose from their seats as music filled the ballroom. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting warm patterns across the polished floor. At the far end of the room, Daniel waited with a smile that seemed impossible to contain. Near the entrance stood Edward and Emily. Both were dressed elegantly, but neither appeared focused on the celebration itself. Their attention remained fixed on Samuel and Ava. As the procession began, Samuel offered his arm. Ava placed her hand gently upon it. Then they started walking. No speeches interrupted the moment. No dramatic announcements followed. Only the sound of music and the soft footsteps of two people crossing a room filled with witnesses. Edward felt his eyes grow wet as they passed. He watched Samuel move through the sunlight with the same quiet dignity he had carried decades earlier. Nothing about the man had changed. Not his kindness, not his humility, not his character. Emily reached for her father's hand. Neither needed words. They both understood. Some people leave marks on the world through wealth, influence, or power. Others leave something far greater behind. They leave examples, lessons, lives made better simply because they chose compassion when no one was watching. As Samuel reached the front of the ballroom, he placed Ava's hand into Daniel's. The morning light settled across their faces. Around them, friends and family smiled through tears of happiness. Samuel stepped back quietly and took his seat. He did not seek attention. He never had. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the gardens, carrying the scent of roses through an open window. Inside, peace settled over the room like sunlight. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by love, gratitude, and second chances, the most powerful thing present was not the venue, the ceremony, or the celebration. It was the simple truth Samuel Johnson had lived his entire life proving. A person's worth is measured not by status, wealth, or appearance, but by the kindness they leave behind in the hearts of others.